talk about what is hot off the press. This past weekend or this past week, Labor Day weekend, it would have been last weekend. Mayor of City of Saginaw, she has been having a series of meetings, prayer sessions with pastors in the community, and I think she had probably her most successful one this past week, having a Stop the Violence prayer rally over at Borscher Park. And for those of you, when I say Borscher Park, you don't know what I'm talking about. I didn't know what it was either, but it's a small park that is across the street, adjacent to parking from the courthouse, across the street from the courthouse, adjacent to their parking space. And it started with a prayer with a number of pastors from the community, both black and white. As a matter of fact, there was a great diversity of pastors that were in attendance. We had the 95th state rep Amos O'Neill. Also the Flint mayors, the mayor of the city of Flint, and their state rep as well was in attendance. And those pastors prayed. And they gave some insight on things that they were doing united as a united front to really quail the call for violence. And the reason I think it's important, because I always get asked the question, Black America is so upset about what happens as it relates to police and police brutality and the assaults and things. What are they doing in their community? I need you to understand that we're upset about what happens when it comes to gun violence in our community. And I need you to understand that there are communities across the nation. It's just not the city of Saginaw, but communities across the nation have experienced an extreme increase in the amount of violence. And we're just as outraged about that type of violence. But there's not a need for us to broadcast that to a larger audience because it's something that's happening in the community. So we have to begin to act and do and take care of things that are in the community. But I want to say this, that does not allow a defer whenever we talk about violence as it relates to, police officers and things of that nature. I've heard a lot of people defer back to, well, what about what happens when Black people are killing Black people in your community? Don't Black Lives Matter? Those are two separate issues. I don't have to bring you to the conversation table when we're talking about what's happening in my community or in my neighborhood. However, if it's something that's pervasive and that is across those lines, we need to have that conversation. But I did want to let many of you who are out there that know, yes, our communities are mobilizing. They are having conversations. They're talking. They're strategizing. There's been some horrific things that have been happening in every major city across the region. And so people are doing things. It is necessary. And I'll tell you, there's something called the no snitch code. For those of you who don't know what that is, that means, back in the days of the mafia, they had this no snitch code. That is something that we find pervasive. And when we're talking about violence in communities, in urban communities, it is greater. There's not just one particular thing that we're dealing with. We're also dealing with another issue called poverty. And then there's a whole cycle of things that need to be addressed as we take care of those things. But I want to say kudos to Mayor Brenda Moore for putting together such an amazing event, marching over the Court Street Bridge and back, declaring an end to gun violence. Also, just a really quick Hurricane Ida. We have seen many hurricanes in our time. We saw Hurricane Katrina, Hugo, all of these other hurricanes. But I've never seen a hurricane come through. I think this is the largest hurricane that has ever hit the United States. This Category 4. It was destructive, to say the least. But what was most intriguing about this hurricane, Rob, is that this hurricane didn't just make its presence known in the Gulf, as most hurricanes do, or on the Atlantic front. No. But it has actually the majority of deaths that occurred with Hurricane Ida were actually in the Northeast.
That's right, New York and New Jersey, I think.
Yeah, and it was due to the flooding. And so when I saw this, I said, wow, this is absolutely amazing. I could not imagine all of the flooding that would have taken place in New York and New Jersey and Boston and areas like that are so far removed from the impact or the initial impact of this hurricane. But I think that this goes to have for us to have a larger conversation about climate change and what's happening and what is going on. We're praying for everyone from the Gulf that was affected by this all the way up to the Atlantic Northeast. This has been a horrific hurricane storm that has taken place. And not only that, but here in the city of Saginaw, we have experienced this past week some crazy weather. Rob, I'll tell you, 5 minutes, I'm out. 1 minute, I'm outside. 5 minutes later, there's a storm that's coming through, 65, 70-mile-per-hour winds, rain gusts that are just throwing things all over the place, hurling trees and branches through the air at will. And I went back to my family home. My uncle still, is over at the family home here in Carlton, right on the other side of the station here. And we have trees all down, all around the house. Power lines were yanked from the house. So the home is without power. It has just been horrific. I was coming up Center Avenue from Midland, not Center Avenue, Midland Road from Midland. And between, I believe it's Shattuck and McCarty, it was almost like a war zone. You're zigzagging to get through trees and down power lines.
Wow.
I have never seen.
To say nothing of the traffic lights out in various places throughout the city.
All over the place.
Right.
And so I happened to, and I got over to, this was the craziest thing. I got over to Kroger. There was a loud boom when we were inside and the lights went out at Kroger and the power went out. And I said, this is something that I hadn't experienced. But it seems that these types of storms, I was listening to the Governor Newsom out in California talking about the raging of the wildfires. This has been the hottest season yet. We're continually, over the past 17 years, we've experienced the 17 hottest summers as it relates to those wildfires out in California. We have, no rain coming in. We've got crazy storms popping up left and right. And this is only the beginning of the hurricane season. So we have a lot time to go left. So I'm praying that we continually keep focused on what's important out there. All right, now I want to go to this next thought. And there's been a lot of conversation about redistricting, and we're talking about political redistricting. What are the gerrymandering? Basically, is what they're talking about taking place. There's a lot of conversation about the big lie that took place about our elections being rigged, and then also I want to talk about a little bit something, and this kind of goes in line with some of the stuff that we've talked about. This concept of the new Jim Crow that many Republican states are trying to institute these new laws, which are prohibiting and restricting voting rights that we have. Rob, this is something that I've never, well, of course, in our lifetime, we've never seen it. We've just received some of these benefits. And because of that, we are now have to make sure that we are strong and that we're poised and that we're keeping in line and in sync with what is happening in our community. And what we see happening in Texas and Georgia and Oklahoma and Florida and all of these other states is actually very frightening to me to see these things take place, because we are now being pushed back to what is seemingly, as President Obama said, this is the new Jim Crow. And so now I have a concern. We have senators like Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. And I've mentioned his name a number of times. And I've called down to West Virginia to some of my compadres in the area. One of my co-hosts from Straight Talk with Kareem Bowen on KISS WTLZ is now in West Virginia. Her husband is now the chief of staff at one of the hospitals there. And I had a conversation like, what are you guys doing down there about Senator Joe Manchin? And everything, he's refusing to remove the filibuster. He's refusing to really make sure that they are able to stand up and create some laws that prohibit some of the things that are taking place. And this is where I find Black America being in a very dangerous place, because that was the topic of conversation 2 months ago. That was the top conversation about what's happening with the voting rights and how they're being attacked. But now we have Afghanistan now come into the forefront. America has fully ended its longest war by pulling out of Afghanistan. Now we also see these tornadoes, these hurricanes. So we have Hurricane Ida coming in and wreaking havoc on everything west or east of the Mississippi, destroying everything in its path. We now see wildfires that are taking the spotlight, and we have to deal with those because these are very important issues. There's an infrastructure bill out there for $3.5 trillion that has to be taken into account. And we see what is most important to me, which is making sure that my voting rights and that we don't go back to Jim Crow, suddenly being put at the bottom of the deck of the pile of things that are important for us to deal with. Rob, what were you
along with the insurrection of January 6th, we still have issues with that, on how to bring people to justice for that, including those who were involved with getting that started. We can't forget about that either, because that's the whole structure of our basis of our democracy factor.
Absolutely. So we see all of these things going on. They're all very important, but none of these things are. Well, let me tell you this. But in terms of what is most important to my life,
right,
and historically perspective, because I think death, when anyone is faced with death or the loss of their entire life and their lives, all those things are important. But what I am being faced with, and what that, to me, this is a hurricane. This is a wildfire that is brewing, that has the ability to put us right back into the 1940s, 1940s, 1930s, before we've had these opportunities and these rights to do these. And just
to say nothing that in outer space, we're talking about the sun's going to have some issues with our internet. They were talking about that too. I don't know if you read the science reports, but even though we have underwater cables and whatnot, our internet would be affected worldwide.
And I heard a word that I only heard in science fiction movies: solar flares.
Yes,
I was like, oh my God, this is so all of these things are going on. It's important for us to make sure that we understand what is important. To me, I know what's important. Making sure voting, because voting, your vote is your voice, and to lose the right or access to voting means that we're losing a voice at the table, Rob. And this is a very dangerous time in our nation, as we see the systems and the institutions of our nation being threatened by individuals who have a desire simply to win. It's not about what is right or what's best for the country, but it's how can I remain in power? How can I win? And I'm willing to do so at all costs. So I think one of the issues that's going to come up, Senator Joe Manchin, if you're listening, and I know you're not listening to my program, but if you should happen to hear that we got to begin to move, let's remove the filibuster. I tell you that I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm an independent, but I see so many things that are being attacked. We just saw some more legislation towards abortion and women's right to have an abortion. Now, I'll tell you, I am pro-life. I believe that, life is precious and we should protect it at all costs. However, I think that a woman has the right to do whatever she wants to do with her body. People are going to do what they want to do anyways. And who am I to tell you what you can do? Now, you can understand that when it comes to vaccinations, that I should have the right to say if I take a vaccine or not. But we don't understand that when it comes to a woman's right to control her own body. So those are the things that are hot off the press. Those are things that I think that we need to continually talk about. These are things that we're going to keep our eye on. And as we move forward, we'll continue that conversation. All right. But we're going to get smack dab into the heart of what we're talking about on today. I want to make sure that we are getting here. We're going to continue this conversation about white fragility. And I brought my book with me, Rob. I don't know if you have your book with you today or not.
No.
Okay, you didn't bring it today, but I want to do a brief recap so that you guys can be caught up to speed as to where we are. First of all, I want to talk over the past couple of weeks, we talked about how race is, we talk about race as a social construct, the fact that race is not something that is really real, but it's something that is social. It is something that we have created as a social construct. We saw it at the very beginning with colonization coming in, a group of people coming in and identifying a difference between them and the other individuals that existed here. And so wiping a nation out. We see that in the Voting Rights Act. We see that in the fact that white women were allowed to vote. Black women until 1965 were denied the right to vote. So we see the fact that race is something that is a social construct that really allows us to be able to differentiate between people that are here on the earth. Not that it is a real thing, but it's a social experiment that we have taken in, and we now take this as something that is valid, but it's really something that we've constructed. We've talked about myths of individualism and objectivity. And these things make it possible for white America to recognize how their views and actions are shaped by the white society in which they were raised. We also conquered the ideas or the origins of whiteness and how white racial identity came to be associated with what we consider structural or societal dominance in all facets of our society. We talked a little bit about the difference between prejudice and racism. Mm-hmm. And, prejudice is, we all have prejudices. We all have something that is called a bias. As a matter of fact, I do some training on bias, and we all have biases. But racism and prejudice are different. Prejudice is something that we have that is considered a bias based upon the things that we have seen, our experiences, those things. But racism are the actions that we take. It's how we actually move and use those biases to make a difference in how we do things. All right. And we also understood it, and I hope that you understand. The author says, and I agree with her. Robin DiAngelo says that it's impossible for Black America to be racist, because in order to be racist, you have to be at the center of that power structure in order for you to carry out those systems. So it's important for us to understand the difference between those things. We continued with the ways in which white supremacy defines who makes decisions and who wields power in the nation's political, economic, social, and cultural institutions, with white people largely unwilling to even acknowledge the existence of these power dynamics. Rob, we've had conversations about systemic racism on here, and people just don't want to believe that it exists.
That's right.
And they get uncomfortable talking about a system of racism that is underneath our systems in our country.
If you're not a victim of it, you wouldn't want to talk about it because you don't understand it.
Absolutely. And that is what our author DiAngelo is talking about on today. Robin DiAngelo is talking. We talked about the idea of meritocracy, and really in short, meritocracy is the fact that we work and we achieve based upon our own merits. If we work hard, we do the right thing, we invest, and we do all of the things that are necessary for success, that we would be successful. What aspects, I'm going to ask you this question, what aspects of your own intelligence, your motivation, and your hard work have contributed to the successes that you have had in your life, solely dependent upon what you have done? We're going to take a quick commercial break here, and we're going to continue this conversation on white fragility. We're going to talk about chapters 3 to 5 on today. Stick and stay. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this commercial break.
United Shades of Gray will continue on WSGW. You're listening to United Shades of Gray on WSGW.
Hey, this is Kareem. We're back with more United Shades of Gray. I want to thank you guys for staying with us over the commercial break. And for those of you watching on social media, thank you so very much. You can get involved in this conversation. If you have something that you like to share, you have a question, comment, thought, or concern, by calling us at 776-6517 or 776-6518. We certainly thank you for being a part of this conversation as we continue. All right, so today we're going to cover basically chapters 3 through 5 through the book, White Fragility, and you've seen the book. We've shown you this a number of times. And those 3 chapters, just to give you the chapter headers: racism after the civil rights movement. We're going to talk about chapter 4, which is how does race shape the lives of white people. And then number 5, chapter 5, is the good/bad binary. And I want to spend probably a little bit more time on chapter 5. We'll paraphrase and kind of talk about the ideas or the tenets of those other chapters. But we're going to get into chapter 5 on today as we talk about the good/bad binary, because I think it's something that is very important. We can see this in our constructs on today. So today we'll continue to explore in greater detail white people and how they are socially conditioned from birth to accept and support white supremacy. Now, when we talk about white supremacy, and I love to make sure that we are understood and we clear about this, because I'll tell you, in my mind, and from my experiences, when I think of the term white supremacy, Rob, in my mind, and you said that your experience has not been the same. I think, I'm thinking of a skinhead. I'm thinking about the Klan. I'm thinking about anger. I'm thinking about, white folks with shaved heads that are sitting there. We're going to, anything that's not white, if you're not a part of the Aryan nation, that we're going to destroy you. What is the idea or the thought that's conjured in your mind when you think about white supremacy?
In my view, has been when whites think they're better than anyone else.
Okay.
And put on that air as if they're privileged in that sense. Because of their skin color, and because of their quote unquote known history of having been superior or getting others to submit to them. The Native Americans can tell you that for themselves. The fact that they grabbed a host of slaves from Africa and the Caribbean is that because we were less than they were, and the fact that our Constitution says that we're 1/3 human. Or 1/5 human, whichever the term might be.
And you're talking about something that is in the annals of our history, as we say.
Right.
And so I think it's important. And I say this all the time, these things are important. I wanted to make sure that we made that clear, because a lot of times the images that I have kind of thrown out there are the ideas that I know people in the community often think.
I would call that white hate, what you described.
Right. And so I want to make sure that there's a difference, because when we talk about white hate, is very different than white supremacy. When we talk about white supremacy, we're talking about the fact that the structures and the systems in our country, white dominance, the white control, are centered around the ideologies, the thoughts, the factions, and the desires of white America. So when we talk about white supremacy, we're talking about the fact that everything that exists in our nation has an underlying factor that the white man was at the table, that he controlled what would not be, and how we would move forward. So let's make sure that we understand that. So we're not sitting here talking about everybody is a part of the white hate group. No, that's not what we're saying. No. But I want to make sure that we make that distinction, because sometimes I think that gets lost in translation.
Because there's black hate as well.
Absolutely, there is. And so we'll talk today a little bit about white people, even those who profess to be, I have a lot of friends who profess to be free of bias, and they sustain, but they also continue to sustain and uphold this concept of white supremacy. And the way that they do that is by a diluted belief in color blindness. And when I say color blindness, I've had a number of people, Rob, who tell me, I don't see color, I don't see black or white, and they don't understand how offensive that is to me. And so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about color blindness, because I need you to see me, and I need you to see me as a black man. The concept or the idea of race talk that reinforces white solidarity and codes racial minorities, particularly African Americans, as dangerous, and without explicitly mentioning black people. We'll talk about how that occurs and what exactly that is. We're also going to talk about maintaining segregated neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, and workspaces. We're going to talk about the spaces that are owned and where people are working, where people are allowed and welcome. And then also we're going to talk, hopefully today, there's a lot, I'm biting off a big chew today. We're going to talk about romanticizing the past. And this will make a lot of sense to you, Rob. Ignoring the hardships of lives of people of color during these previous periods of time. Today, I want to say I saw, witness a statue of, it wasn't Robert E. Lee. That was being removed after the complaints of, who he was, what he represented, and what period of time. So as we talk
General
about
Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy back in the Civil War.
So as we talk about romanticizing these things, it's interesting that today we would have that conversation and that statue would be removed. A lot of people were really upset about that, but we need to understand why romanticizing these periods of time are so problematic and why they continue this process of white supremacy. All right, so there was another book that I had, Dr. Dawn Hinton, who is a sociology professor out at Saginaw Valley State University. She's been on our show again, and I got to bring her back in because I know this conversation.
She's awesome.
She is amazing. And she gave me a book that I read a while ago, and it was titled Racism Without Racists. And so when we begin to have that conversation, I need you to understand this is all a part of that delusion of colorblindness. The successful things that we saw take place in the 50s and the 60s with the civil rights movement were a watershed moment for our nation. We saw images of Black folk being beaten, protesters, women and children, brutally beaten in southern states by sheriffs and everybody. It just seemed horrific images that we were able to segregated lunch counters and young girls being blown up in churches. These were all of the images that were a part of the movement as we were marching towards our civil rights. That's why what's happening with this Voting Rights Act is so very important. Yes, because it puts us in a position that we could revert back to a time where, we were fully, considered to be 3/5 human, according to our Constitution. Moreover, the landmark registration of 1964 and the Voting Rights Acts of 1965, which we've alluded to earlier, they represented the first serious federal efforts to dismantle the system of legal segregation and the disenfranchisement that defined American life that existed after the Civil War. Okay, overt expressions of racism on the part of white people became socially taboo. When we talk about this, Rob, we're talking about the things, those images, water hoses, dogs being sent out, the Ku Klux Klan. All of these types of images that we saw during that period of time became taboo. No one wanted to be associated with those things. People began to separate themselves. And we saw even those good old folk in the North who were standing by our side. When I say standing by our side, standing for those who cried out, because I wasn't even alive during this period of time. But the interesting thing is that the Voting Rights Act and the acts that took place in 1965 and 1968 concurrently were within 7-8 years of my coming to the earth. It's hard to imagine as a young Black professional that just 8 years before my being here, Black women did not have the right to vote. I can't imagine that. It is absolutely beyond me, but to imagine a time that existed that these things it's crazy. But anyway, so as we look at those types of images, those types of character traits became taboo in America. But what did not happen, however, just because those things became taboo, Rob, it doesn't mean that white America did the hard work, the difficult work of examining how institutional racism existed in our society. It doesn't mean that they did the hard work of how they were able to dismantle those systems. But what was bad was just the actions of overt racism. Right. And so,
because had the hard work been done, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Absolutely. And so this is
not to say what hard work was not done, just not enough hard work and continuously going on.
Right. And not only that, but not only the issues of overt racism that became taboo, but we did not do the work of dismantling racism from those systems, going in and to remove those things. And we never addressed the issues of the privilege that came from the systems that were at play. You've been in this studio with me, Rob, and we've had individuals come in here, great-minded, great-hearted individuals with a desire to really see some change happen and bring people together.
Right.
Feel uncomfortable when it came to talking about the issues of how do we deal with the issue of white privilege. When we talk about the concept of white privilege, it's important to understand that if this entire system base that we're operating from, our economic system, our civic systems, and our political systems, our housing systems, our banking systems,
education systems,
our education systems,
yes.
All of these things, all of these systems, as you said earlier, were all created at a time when we were not even considered to be human.
Right.
And I say that the best way to be able to create or to do harm to an individual is to dehumanize them. And that's what we saw happen. We saw Black people be treated pretty much like animals, and it was okay because they weren't fully human.
Right.
They were subhuman, and therefore the treatment that we received was okay because we weren't real human.
We were less than.
We were less than. And so our Constitution, the founding fathers, all of our systems that existed, all were based from this white supremacy system. So that means that white supremacy is at the foundation of every system that exists in America. And along with this white supremacy that exists, there also is something called white privilege. We have done a lot to stop some of the ailments and the things that exist as it relates to the racism that exists in systems.
I need to point out real quick, though, Robin does point out that white privilege does exist.
Absolutely.
A white woman acknowledges the existence of white privilege.
And she's not the only one.
No, she's not.
But her putting it in a book and the way she puts it in a book
yes.
is very profound.
Right.
So it's important for us to understand that although there have been a lot of work and focus on removing racism out of systems and dealing with racism in systems, nothing has been done to really deal with the privilege that yet exists in the basis of those systems. And by not doing so, we continually purport a system which is white supremacist.
Which is why this show exists. Shows like this exist to talk about it, to bring this to the table, to have a conversation about it. We need to talk about it so we can resolve the issue.
Absolutely. So what existed? So what began to happen, Rob, is because these images, and there are a lot of people, and I want to thank you for all of those who lean in and say, you're listening to this conversation because you're saying, listen, I'm not for it. I don't tolerate it. I don't want to be that person. And hopefully there's some people out there. And I know that there's going to be another group of people that are saying, listen, why are you always talking about race? It frustrates me. It angers me. We all need to lean in. And I want us to begin to say this, because what we began to see take place, Rob, is that there was a honing in or a seizing in on the idea of color blindness. And the idea of color blindness came from us misappropriating the idea of what Dr. Martin Luther King said. And I've heard people say this to me. I've heard white Americans say this to me. You know, Dr. King, I don't see colors. I don't see black or white. You know, I don't judge people by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Remember when Dr. King made that statement about his 4 little children, one day in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And so there are people that seized in on this concept of color blindness, where they no longer see color. And we need to understand that when you do that and you no longer see color, you no longer see me as...
You're kind of erasing us in a bit.
Exactly. You no longer see me. You don't understand. You no longer see my pain. You no longer see my struggle. Historically, what I have gone through as a person and my people as a people of color disappears since you no longer see color. And you become tone deaf to the issues that exist in communities where people of color have suffered and have gone through a number of atrocities.
To say nothing, you get to ignore my culture and the way I speak and the way I carry myself. Absolutely.
So denying race, denying racism. All right. So this color blindness allows or it enabled Americans to delude themselves into believing that they could avoid problems of race by simply pretending that they didn't exist. I'm not going to see color. And because I don't see color, the issues that you talk about, they don't exist. So white people often claim color blindness through statements like this, because I need us to understand and hear what it sounds like, right?
Or they exist, but they're just irrelevant.
They're irrelevant.
Which is even worse.
But the author does a great job of giving us these statements. And when I read this, I said, ooh, how many times have I heard that? One of the statements is, I don't see race. Another, race doesn't matter to me. I judge people, everyone based on the merits as an individual. I don't care if someone's black, white, green, or orange. We had a caller that had sent a message to me saying, Kareem, I don't care if people black, white, or orange. All I see is that if they're good people, I treat them good. If they're bad people, I treat them bad. And then they go on to tell me about how one of their best friends is white, is black. And we hear these statements and people don't understand what this means. And so I need you to understand that even as we begin to deal with what is not desirable is black people don't want to not be seen as black people. We want you to see us in all of the rich heritage of our blackness. We want you to acknowledge the fact that the reason why sun tanning is so beautiful is because you acknowledge the beautiful hues and the tones of our dark melanin in our skin. And there's nothing wrong with that. See me as a black man. Just treat me as your equal. That becomes a statement in which becomes so very important. All right. And so the reality of the situation is that it's impossible because remember I talked about race being a social construct. And so even though we say we don't see color, it's impossible for us not to see color because our entire system and our entire governance in terms of how we operate, what we put value in, has all been constructed through the social demographics of what we now consider and call race. All right. I want to read really quick, and I don't know, we don't have much time, but I want to read a piece of D'Angelo's book. And I want us to go to we're going to jump to chapter 5, where we're talking about the good, bad binary. All right. I'm going to read something here. It says, where do I want to begin this? Races with all right, so we're going to start here. Chapter 5, page 1 is where I put my sticky note. This chapter explores what is perhaps the most effective adaptation of racism in recent history. It's called the good bad binary. Prior to the civil rights movement, it was socially acceptable for white people to openly proclaim their belief in their racial superiority. But when white Northerners saw the violence black people, including women and children, endured during the civil rights protests, they were appalled. These images that became the archetypes of racists. After the civil rights movement, to be a good moral person and to be complicit with racism became mutually exclusive. You could not be a good person and participate in racism. Only bad people were racist. And this is important. I want you guys to listen to this. These images of black persecution in South during the civil rights movement of the 60s allowed Northern whites to position races as always Southern. To accomplish this adaptation, racism first needed to be reduced to simple, isolated, and extreme acts of prejudice. These acts must be intentional, malicious, and based on conscious dislike of someone because of race. Racists were those white people in South smiling and picnicking at the base of lynching trees, store owners posting whites only signs over drinking fountains, and good old boys beating innocent children such as Emmett Till to death. In other words, racists were mean, ignorant, old, uneducated, Southern whites, nice people, well-intended people, open-minded, middle-class people. People raised in enlightened North could not be racist. And this is so very important. So according to this, we gave two different definitions when we talk about the bad, good binary, the racist bad, good binary. Bad or good means it's a toggle switch. Either you're one or you're the other. And we see that with computers, O and 1, on and off. A light switch, you turn it on, you turn it off. So you're either one or the other. A racist, or who was bad, was an individual who was ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, old, and Southern. All right. That was one side. The other side of this binary code, a non-racist or someone that was good or moral, was progressive, educated, open-minded, well-intended, young, and usually from the North. Rob, when you hear that binary code, what comes to mind? What does that make you think of?
Two-Face. Two-Face, because I think I read that part of that before, and I was listening to you. I think of two-face in this because just because you're clear cut doesn't mean that inside your soul, inside your essence, that you're not a racist person yourself. The first part of the binary represents the stereotype.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people fit that stereotype. You can look at a person who's dressed, who talks with a Southern drawl and say he must be a racist or a redneck,
Absolutely.
quote unquote. And then you could talk to a nice white person or a nice young white man or a white woman, whatnot, and not have a clue that they'll hate your guts or hate where you come from.
Yeah, Rob, I agree with you 100%. And then the other thing is, this extra camera, Rob, you could have actually pointed. So people are like, "Who's talking in the background?"
Oh,
You could actually point it toward yourself. But what I also want to address is
I'm
that
camera shy.
if you begin to take a look at this binary, what happens is it deals with the extreme areas or the extreme cases or the extreme actions, but it doesn't deal with the ideology that is pervasive, nor does it deal with the privilege that exists from the ideology that started from its onset. All right, so I want to continue real quick. Let me read the second part and we're going to continue this conversation. The good-bad binary certainly obscures the structure, and this is really the first time I've taken time to read from this book, but I think that this is important. The good binary certainly obscures the structural nature of racism, and it makes it difficult for us to see or understand. Equally problematic is the impact of such a worldview in our actions. If, as a white person, I conceptualize racism as a binary and I place myself on the not racist side, what further action is required of me? No action is required because I'm not a racist. Okay, so what this does is now, since I don't do X, Y, and Z, I can check the box off. I'm not racist.
And I have black friends.
And I have black friends. And since I'm not racist, there is no more work for me to be done. It goes on to say you're a requirement that applicants have an advanced degree. Now, this is something that I want us to look at this, because we say that we're not racist, but the constructs of racism are so embedded in our systems that there are things that we do that are racist. And because we see things from a white supremacist perspective, we don't understand. And that's why I say some good intended white folk who are listening to these conversations are making decisions and doing things that they aren't intending to be racist, but because our systems are based on a white supremacist perspective, that they do these things with well intentions, not realizing that they're racist in their nature.
They can't help themselves.
They can't. And this occurs. Now, there is a requirement often that we say your requirement that applicants have an advanced degree rather than an equivalent experience and automatically disqualifies some of our applicants that could bring perspective and experiences you say you are looking for. Now, I'm using that example because oftentimes we say that we're not racist. We're going to be, EEO, equal opportunity employer, all these things. But we understand the challenges that exist for Black Americans to make it and to matriculate through college to get a bachelor's degree. So when we now make the standard now a master's degree in this particular thing, that is a racist system that is playing a racist mentality that is playing out through a system that is not necessarily intended to be, but it does not take into account the barriers that exist for people of color that have overcome these systems in order just to get that bachelor's degree. So this is where we begin to understand how our white supremacist systems and the undertones and the foundation of those systems provide a privilege for white America that does not exist for Black America. For those of you who are tuning in today, I want to thank you for this conversation. Hopefully you have been awakened to some degree. Hopefully your eyes have been illuminated. Some of you may be a little bit uncomfortable today. I'm okay with the feeling of discomfort. What I'm going to ask you to do with that discomfort, I'm going to ask you that you begin to examine yourself, examine your motives, examine your surroundings. If your desire is truly to make a difference, then I want you to make a difference. Angela Davis said something very powerful. She says, in a racist society, it is no longer good enough for us to just sit and be non-racist, but we have to be anti-racist. Thank you guys for tuning in today. I want to thank you for tuning in to this week, and stay tuned for next week for more of United Shades of Gray, conversations of race in America.